There is a peculiar moment every loner eventually recognizes. You walk into a room, say very little, observe more than you participate, and somehow people begin forming theories about you. They wonder why you are so quiet, why you do not join every conversation, why you can sit alone without looking uncomfortable. Nobody openly insults you. That would be easier to understand. Instead, they look at you with that strange mixture of curiosity and suspicion reserved for someone who refuses to follow the invisible rules everyone else seems to understand. You are not necessarily disliked. You are simply difficult for them to categorize, and what people cannot categorize, they often call strange. Nietzsche understood something deeply uncomfortable about human beings. Society does not merely want your presence, it wants your participation. It wants you to laugh when everyone laughs, react when everyone reacts, desire what everyone desires, and explain yourself when you choose something different. The moment you step outside that rhythm, people begin wondering what is wrong with you. Not because solitude is inherently abnormal, but because a person who can remain alone becomes difficult to control through the ordinary currencies of social life: approval, attention, belonging, and fear of rejection. This is where the loner becomes psychologically unsettling. Most people are surrounded by signals telling them who they are supposed to be. Friends reflect their identity back to them. Groups provide opinions before they have to form their own. Social approval quietly answers questions they never consciously ask. Am I acceptable? Am I normal? Am I doing enough? The loner removes himself from that constant feedback loop, and when the external mirror disappears, something uncomfortable happens. You are forced to look at yourself without the crowd standing behind you. That is why solitude is often misunderstood. From the outside, a person sitting alone appears disconnected. But internally, that same person may be processing an enormous amount of thought. The crowd sees the empty chair beside them. It does not see the conversation happening inside their mind. It sees silence and assumes emptiness. It sees distance and assumes arrogance. It sees independence and sometimes interprets it as bitterness. The observer mistakes the absence of visible participation for the absence of an inner world. Schopenhauer understood this tension from another direction. He argued that a person becomes increasingly independent as their intellectual and inner life develops because they become less dependent upon what others think. The more a person learns to occupy their own mind, the less desperate they become to occupy the minds of others. That creates a strange paradox. The person who needs the crowd less can appear less human to the crowd, simply because they no longer perform their humanity in the expected way. And this is the first law of why loners appear strange to the masses. Independence looks abnormal when dependence is the social norm. Watch what happens when a group enters a room. Conversations begin almost automatically. Someone tells a story. Someone laughs. Someone checks whether everyone is listening. Someone changes their opinion because the group changed theirs. None of this is necessarily conscious. Humans are social creatures, and much of our behavior is built around maintaining connection. But the loner often interrupts this pattern simply by refusing to perform every expected response. He does not laugh just because everyone else laughed. He does not speak simply because silence has become uncomfortable. He does not reveal personal information merely because the room expects intimacy. He may listen for 10 minutes without feeling the need to contribute a single sentence. To the loner, this is ordinary. To the group, it can feel like a signal. Why is he so quiet? Does she think she is better than us? Why doesn't he want to join? Is something wrong with her? The irony is that the loner may be asking completely different questions. What is actually being said here? Why does everyone agree so quickly? What does this person really mean? Is this conversation worth entering? What happens if I disagree? These questions create a delay between impulse and action, and that delay can look strange in a culture that has learned to treat immediate participation as proof of confidence. Nietzsche repeatedly challenged the assumption that the majority represents the highest form of human development. His philosophy was deeply suspicious of the herd instinct. the tendency to accept values because they are shared rather than because they have been personally examined. The loner does not automatically become a superior person simply because he is alone. That would be another comforting fantasy. But solitude can create the conditions in which a person begins questioning the values they inherited instead of merely repeating them. And questioning inherited values has a social cost. The moment you stop needing everyone to agree with you, you become harder to predict. The moment you stop explaining every decision, people lose access to the reasons behind your behavior. The moment you become comfortable spending an evening alone, invitations lose some of their power. The moment rejection stops terrifying you, manipulation becomes harder. And the moment you discover that your own company is enough to keep you occupied, the crowd loses one of its oldest weapons, the fear of being left outside. This is why some loners are treated as strange long before anyone actually knows them. The judgment comes before the evidence. Silence is interpreted as hostility. Privacy becomes secrecy. Selectiveness becomes arrogance. Independence becomes emotional damage. A person who simply prefers fewer relationships can be diagnosed by strangers with an entire personality they never bothered to investigate. The masses often do not encounter the real person. They encounter the gap between what they expect and what the person provides. And that gap creates suspicion. A socially predictable person is easy to understand. They reveal their preferences quickly. They respond when expected. They seek reassurance when uncertain. They explain themselves when misunderstood. They display their emotions in recognizable ways. The loner may do none of these things. He may disappear for days and return as though nothing unusual happened. He may enjoy people deeply but require long periods away from them. He may care about someone without constantly communicating it. He may reject an opportunity to socialize without feeling rejected himself. To someone who measures connection through constant interaction, this behavior looks cold. But solitude and loneliness are not the same psychological state. Loneliness says, I need someone here because I cannot bear being alone. Solitude says, I can be alone without feeling incomplete. The difference is enormous, yet society often treats them as identical because it is easier to understand a person who needs company than a person who does not always require it. Nietzsche's deeper challenge was not that everyone should become a recluse. His challenge was more disturbing. Become capable of standing apart long enough to discover whether the thoughts inside your head actually belong to you. Because if you cannot tolerate being alone, you may eventually become dependent on the crowd not only for companionship, but for identity itself. And once your identity depends upon the crowd, disagreement begins to feel like an attack. Silence begins to feel like rejection. Solitude begins to feel like punishment. But the person who has learned to stand alone experiences these things differently. They can leave a room without feeling that they have lost themselves. They can disagree without immediately needing reconciliation. They can be misunderstood without desperately correcting every misunderstanding. They can watch the crowd move in one direction and ask the most dangerous question a social creature can ask: what if everyone is wrong? That question is where the loner's real strangeness begins, because the crowd does not fear silence nearly as much as it fears someone who can remain silent while everyone else is demanding an answer. And that is why the loner is often misunderstood. Not because he has nothing to say, but because he has stopped believing that everything inside him must be said aloud. Most loners eventually learn the lesson. They stop explaining themselves. They stop trying to make every silence understandable. They stop announcing what they are thinking just to reassure the room that something is happening inside them. They keep more of their inner world private, and slowly they develop the very habits society taught them to develop, becoming a simpler version of themselves so other people can feel comfortable around them. The room sees the quiet person and reaches two conclusions at once. The social person must be confident. The solitary person must be strange. Both conclusions can be completely wrong. Law 2. The solitude tax. There is another cost to living outside the social rhythm, and this one is harder to recognize because it happens inside the person rather than in the room. The longer you spend alone, the more difficult it can become to explain your inner world to people who have not experienced it. You develop private routines, private thoughts, private standards, private reasons for doing things. They make perfect sense to you because you have lived with them for years. But when someone suddenly asks, "Why are you like this?" there may be no simple answer. You are not necessarily avoiding people. You may simply have stopped needing constant interaction. You are not necessarily angry. You may just enjoy silence. You are not necessarily arrogant. You may have become selective about where you spend your attention. But because your internal reasoning is invisible, other people fill the empty space with their own interpretation. This is one of the strangest problems with solitude. The loner experiences a complete internal explanation, while everyone else receives only the external behavior. You know why you declined the invitation. They only know that you declined. You know why you left the conversation early. They only know that you walked away. You know why you spent the entire evening alone. They only see an empty chair. And the translation between those two realities is where misunderstanding begins. A person who spends years alone can develop a very high tolerance for internal complexity. They may think through an issue for days without discussing it with anyone. They may change their opinion privately several times before finally speaking. They may notice contradictions in themselves that they never reveal because they are still trying to understand them. The outside world, however, usually wants a clean explanation. Why don't you come out anymore? Why don't you talk more? Why don't you have more friends? Why are you so distant? The questions assume that every unusual behavior must have an unusual problem behind it, but sometimes there is no problem. Sometimes a person simply discovered that constant social stimulation was exhausting them. Sometimes they realized that having 50 acquaintances was less valuable than having 2 people they could actually trust. Sometimes they discovered that they enjoyed their own thoughts more than conversations built entirely around gossip, status, and repetition. And sometimes they simply became comfortable enough with themselves that they no longer needed an audience for every moment of their existence. This is where Schopenhauer's view of solitude becomes particularly relevant. He observed that the capacity to endure one's own company is connected to the richness of one's inner life. The person who has nothing inside them becomes desperate for external stimulation. The person who possesses an active inner world can remain alone without experiencing the same emptiness. But there is a darker side to this independence. The more comfortable you become alone, the less practice you get explaining yourself to people who think differently from you. You can become extremely good at understanding yourself and surprisingly bad at being understood by others. Your inner world becomes organized, but your social translation becomes rusty. You know what you mean? They don't. You assume the distinction is obvious. It isn't. You think your silence speaks for itself. It doesn't. And eventually, you begin to wonder whether explaining yourself is even worth the effort. That is the solitude tax. You gain freedom from the crowd, but you may lose fluency with the crowd. Law 3. The stranger arrives before the explanation. Nietzsche understood that society often labels a person before it understands them. The unusual person is rarely granted the luxury of being observed without interpretation. Their behavior becomes evidence for a story that was already written about them. Imagine a person entering a room and sitting alone. They say nothing. Within minutes, the room begins constructing possibilities. Maybe they're shy, maybe they're arrogant, maybe they hate everyone, maybe they think they're better than us. Maybe something is wrong with them. Notice what has happened. The person has not actually done anything. Yet an entire psychological profile has already been created. This is the third law. When someone refuses the social script, people often mistake the absence of familiar signals for the presence of something wrong. The loner does not necessarily reject humanity. He may reject the performance required to belong to a particular group. That distinction matters. There is a difference between not loving people and not enjoying crowds. There is a difference between being emotionally cold and being emotionally private. There is a difference between having no friends and refusing to collect relationships simply to avoid being alone. But the crowd prefers simple categories because simple categories are easier to manage. The quiet person becomes antisocial. The selective person becomes difficult. The independent person becomes arrogant. The private person becomes secretive. The person who does not seek validation becomes weird. The label arrives faster than the understanding. And once the label arrives, everything the person does begins confirming it. If the loner smiles, they are being fake. If they remain silent, they are being arrogant. If they join the conversation, everyone is surprised. If they leave early, everyone says, "See, they're strange." The interpretation has become self-protecting. This is why being different from the group can feel like being placed on trial without ever being told the charges. The social world does not always punish people for being wrong. Sometimes it punishes them for being difficult to interpret. Nietzsche's philosophy repeatedly returns to the danger of the herd, not because every individual in a group is unintelligent, but because groups create invisible pressures that individuals rarely notice while they are inside them. A person can begin believing something simply because everyone around them believes it. They can begin behaving a certain way because everyone else behaves that way. Eventually, conformity stops feeling like conformity. It starts feeling like normal life. The loner interrupts that illusion simply by stepping outside it, and that can be unsettling. Consider how uncomfortable people become when someone says, "I actually like being alone." The statement often requires explanation. Are you okay? Did something happen? Why don't you go out more? Don't you get lonely? The person may answer honestly, "No, I enjoy it." And somehow that answer is harder for people to accept than sadness would have been. Because sadness is understandable. Contentment without the group is threatening. The crowd can understand someone who is desperately searching for belonging. It knows how to offer them a place. It knows how to influence them. It knows what they fear losing. But someone who can walk away without collapsing is a different psychological creature. They cannot be easily controlled by the threat of exclusion. And this is where the loner's real power begins, not in isolation, but in the reduction of fear. If you desperately need to belong, you become negotiable. You tolerate disrespect because leaving would hurt. You agree with opinions you secretly reject because disagreement could cost you the group. You laugh at jokes you dislike because silence might expose you. You remain in relationships that have already died because loneliness feels worse than unhappiness. But once solitude becomes tolerable, these calculations change. You can say no. You can leave. You can disagree. You can sit quietly while everyone else is trying to impress one another. You can watch the group move in a direction you do not believe in and resist the instinct to follow simply because everyone else is moving. That does not make the loner automatically wise. Solitude can produce clarity, but it can also produce delusion. A person can isolate themselves and mistake bitterness for independence, superiority for individuality, and avoidance for strength. Nietzsche would not have celebrated isolation merely for its own sake. The point is not to escape people. The point is to discover whether you can stand apart from them without losing yourself. That distinction separates solitude from hiding. A person hiding from the world is still controlled by the world. They are avoiding judgment, avoiding rejection, avoiding vulnerability. A person who chooses solitude from strength is doing something different. They are saying, "I can participate, but I do not have to." And that sentence changes everything. Because once participation becomes a choice, instead of a psychological necessity, the crowd loses its automatic authority over you. You begin noticing things you previously ignored. How often people change their opinions depending on who is present. How quickly conversations become performances. How many friendships are actually exchanges of attention. How often people say they want honesty but punish anyone who gives it to them. How frequently people claim to value individuality while rewarding imitation. And once you notice these patterns, returning to unconscious participation becomes difficult. The loner is therefore not always someone who failed to fit into society. Sometimes the loner is someone who became conscious of the price of fitting in, and that realization creates another problem. People who are comfortable alone can become difficult to recruit into the emotional economy of the group. They cannot be threatened with loneliness as easily. They cannot be flattered into obedience as easily. They cannot be pressured by the question, "But what will everyone think?" Because eventually they learn something the crowd rarely teaches. Everyone will think something anyway. So you might as well become someone you can live with when the room goes silent. Law 4. The refusal to perform belonging. Most people eventually learn how to perform social belonging. They laugh at the right moment. They respond quickly. They reveal just enough vulnerability to appear approachable. They agree when agreement is convenient. They disagree carefully when disagreement becomes necessary. They learn the subtle gestures that communicate, "I am one of you." There is nothing inherently dishonest about this. Human beings need social cooperation, and social intelligence is a real form of intelligence. But the loner often refuses to perform belonging simply for the sake of being accepted. They may enter a group without trying to impress it. They may remain silent without feeling obligated to fill the silence. They may hear an opinion they disagree with and choose not to argue because proving themselves right is not important to them. They may leave a gathering without creating an elaborate excuse. They may spend an entire weekend alone and feel that nothing is missing. This behavior can look almost offensive to people who have unconsciously built their identity around being socially desired. Because the loner is not necessarily asking for permission, and someone who does not ask for permission is difficult to place inside a hierarchy. That is what society often finds strange, not silence, not solitude, not individuality. The disturbing part is the absence of desperation. The loner may still want friendship, they may still love deeply, they may still crave connection, but they have discovered that connection is something they choose, not something they must constantly prove they deserve. And once someone stops performing belonging, the room has to confront an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe belonging was never the same thing as being understood. Maybe being surrounded by people was never proof that you were not alone. And maybe the person sitting quietly in the corner is not disconnected from the world at all. Maybe they are simply no longer willing to disappear inside it. Schopenhauer offered another way of understanding this refusal. He believed that most human behavior is ultimately connected to what he called the will, the endless machinery of wanting, seeking, competing, possessing, and being recognized. The ordinary person moves through the social world calculating constantly, often without realizing it. Who is watching? Who approves? Who is impressed? Who might reject me? What should I say here? What should I hide? What will this person think if I leave? The loner, at least in his strongest form, gradually steps outside that calculation. Not perfectly, not permanently, but enough to become strange to people who still live almost entirely through it. He may enter a room without asking who has noticed him. He may wear something because he likes it, rather than because it communicates status. He may refuse an invitation without inventing a complicated excuse. He may disagree without turning the disagreement into a battle. He may walk away from a relationship when staying would be easier socially, but destructive internally. He is not necessarily trying to send a message. That is precisely what makes the behavior confusing. Most social behavior contains signals. Even silence can be strategic. People sometimes remain quiet to appear mysterious. They sometimes withdraw to make others chase them. They sometimes pretend not to care because they desperately want to be cared about. But genuine solitude becomes difficult to read because there may be no performance underneath it. The person simply does not need the reaction. And when someone stops calculating every social move, they begin missing signals that other people consider obvious. They may not notice that someone expected a compliment. They may not understand why declining an invitation offended somebody. They may answer a question honestly, when a socially acceptable answer would have been easier. They may leave a conversation because they are finished, while everyone else interprets the departure emotionally. The room calls this tactlessness. The loner experiences it as not wanting to play a game nobody announced. This is why genuinely independent people can appear socially awkward even when they are intellectually sharp. Their attention is pointed somewhere else. They are not constantly scanning the room for approval, rejection, hierarchy, and opportunity. They are simply living, and society is often deeply uncomfortable with someone who refuses to participate in its invisible calculations. Think about the person who does not compete for attention at work. They do not interrupt. They do not constantly advertise their accomplishments. They do not stay late merely to be seen staying late. They complete their work and leave. At first, people may admire them. Then they become suspicious. Why doesn't he care about getting noticed? Why doesn't she try harder to impress the boss? Does he think he's better than everyone? The person may not think any of those things, but the room needs an explanation, so it invents one. This is what happens when someone refuses to perform belonging. Their behavior becomes a blank surface onto which other people project their own assumptions. And Nietzsche understood something brutal about this. Society does not merely pressure people to behave alike, it pressures them to desire alike, to want the same things, to fear the same losses, to measure success using the same ruler. The loner becomes strange when that ruler stops working on them. Law 5. The Cassandra effect. There is a difference between being alone because you have been rejected and being alone because you have noticed something the group does not want to notice. The second kind of loner can become particularly uncomfortable because sometimes the person who stands outside the group is the first person capable of seeing what the group has normalized. Imagine a workplace where everyone knows the environment has become toxic, but nobody says it. Everyone complains privately. Everyone jokes about it. Everyone knows the manager is destroying morale. But no one wants to be the first person to say it publicly. Then one employee finally does. The room goes quiet. Suddenly the problem is no longer an invisible inconvenience. It has a name. And the person who named it becomes the problem. Not because they created the situation, because they made it impossible to pretend the situation did not exist. This is the Cassandra effect. The person sees something early, speaks about it early, and is punished precisely because the truth arrives before people are emotionally prepared to accept it. The loner is often positioned perfectly for this kind of perception because they are less invested in maintaining the emotional comfort of the group. They may notice the friendship that everyone knows is fake. They may notice the relationship everyone pretends is healthy. They may notice the workplace culture everyone complains about but continues defending. They may notice that the person everyone admires is actually manipulating the room, and sometimes they say nothing, not because they are afraid, because they have learned what happens when you tell people something they are emotionally invested in not knowing. The group does not always attack the truth directly. It attacks the person carrying it. You're being negative. You're overthinking. You're too serious. You're jealous. You're bitter. You're antisocial. You're making things complicated. These words are often less about the accuracy of an observation than about restoring emotional comfort, because accepting the loner's observation may require change, and change is expensive. It may require admitting that the relationship was wrong, that the leader was incompetent, that the friendship was built on convenience, that the group was following something meaningless, that years were spent pursuing a goal that never mattered. People can tolerate an uncomfortable truth much more easily when it does not require them to change their identity. But when the truth demands a confession, the messenger becomes dangerous. The loner learns this quickly. They watch someone speak honestly and get excluded. They watch someone challenge the group and suddenly become difficult. They watch someone stop pretending and become the subject of gossip. Eventually, many stop speaking, not because they have nothing to say, because they understand the price of saying it. This is one of the darkest transformations solitude can produce. At first, the loner is silent because they prefer silence. Later, they may become silent because they have discovered how much other people punish uncomfortable honesty. The world then looks at their silence and says, "See, they were always strange." But it never asks what taught them to stop explaining themselves. Law 6. The mirror they cannot bear. There is a final layer, deeper than all the others. The masses do not always reject the loner because the loner is different. Sometimes they reject the loner because the loner reveals something about them. Plato understood this through the cave. People live among shadows and eventually forget they are shadows. They become comfortable with the familiar version of reality because familiarity feels like truth. Then someone steps outside the pattern. Someone questions what everyone else accepts. Someone stops participating in the performance, and when that person returns, they do not necessarily bring a comfortable message, they bring a mirror. The loner can become that mirror simply by refusing to pretend. When everyone is obsessed with appearing successful, the person who says, "I don't actually want this," becomes uncomfortable. When everyone is desperate to be seen, the person who says, "I don't need attention," becomes uncomfortable. When everyone is terrified of being alone, the person who says, "I enjoy my own company," becomes uncomfortable. When everyone is maintaining a relationship because they are afraid of starting over, the person who leaves becomes uncomfortable. The loner's existence quietly asks a question without saying a word. If I can live without this, why can't you? That question can hurt more than criticism, because criticism attacks behavior. A mirror attacks the story people tell themselves about their behavior. The loner does not have to call anyone fake. They only have to stop pretending themselves. And suddenly, the contrast becomes visible. The person who never posts about their life exposes how much others need to display theirs. The person who does not chase relationships exposes how many people are terrified of being unwanted. The person who can sit alone exposes how many people surround themselves with noise because silence would force them to meet themselves. The person who refuses to join every argument exposes how many arguments are really performances for recognition. This is why some people become strangely aggressive toward loners who have done nothing to them. The loner is not attacking them. The loner is simply refusing to participate in the same illusion. And sometimes that is enough. Nietzsche's deepest concern was never simply that society misunderstands unusual individuals. His concern was that the individual can eventually misunderstand himself because of society. That is the real danger. You begin alone. Someone tells you that being alone is strange. You begin explaining yourself. They still misunderstand you, so you change. You become louder, more available, more agreeable, more socially predictable. You learn how to perform the version of yourself that receives the least resistance. And eventually everyone likes you, everyone understands you, everyone approves of you, and somewhere along the way, you disappear. That is the tragedy. The greatest danger for a loner is not being misunderstood by the masses. It is becoming so desperate to be understood that you abandon the person they misunderstood in the first place. So perhaps the goal is not to become more social, and it is not to become more isolated either. The goal is something much harder, to be able to enter the crowd without being absorbed by it, to speak without needing applause, to remain silent without needing to appear mysterious, to love people without needing them to complete you, to leave when you must without turning departure into revenge, to stand alone without turning loneliness into superiority, and most importantly, to know the difference between solitude and escape. Because not every loner is deep. Some are simply wounded. Some are avoiding responsibility. Some have turned isolation into an excuse to never be challenged. Nietzsche would not ask you to worship loneliness. He would ask you to use solitude as a test. Remove the crowd, remove the applause, remove the constant opinions, remove the need to be seen. Then ask yourself what remains. If you discover nothing, the silence will feel unbearable. If you discover an entire world inside yourself, the silence will become freedom. And perhaps that is why loners appear strange to the masses. They are not always different because they know more. They are different because they have spent enough time without the crowd to discover which parts of themselves survive when nobody is watching. The crowd may call that strange. Nietzsche might call it the beginning of becoming yourself.